Hello and welcome everyone to our third and final Urban Teachers Speaker Series. My name is Japera Parker. I'm the Assistant Director of Urban Teachers Baltimore, and I'm joined by Malene Bell, expert in restorative practices and mental health and wellness for educators. So thank you for joining us, Malene.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So I want to start by giving a brief background of Malene's work, and then I have some questions that we've curated for you before we open it up to the audience here and the audience on Facebook Live to ask any questions they may have as well. Okay, so let's get started by reading your background.
Okay.
Co-founder of Restorative Solutions, Malene Bell is passionate about justice and well-being. As a restorative practices consultant, Malene trains and supports schools in whole school implementation, helping to increase positive relationships while decreasing school violence and the punitive consequences of suspensions, administered disproportionately among students of color and students with disabilities by as much as 60%. She's also the founder of Sage Wellness, an initiative that supports the well-being and resilience of teachers and service workers through professional development, mindfulness education, and on-site wellness retreats. A published author, Malene holds an MA in writing from the Johns Hopkins University and a master's degree of metaphysical science from the University of Metaphysics in holistic coaching. Again, welcome, Malene.
Thank you.
So I want to start our conversation looking at just the overview of mental health trends in teacher preparation programs like Urban Teachers and then across the district in general, and then shift to some right there techniques that our teachers can use in the classroom as they struggle to find effective self-care routines. And then I would like to end with a look at restorative practices, primary and secondary trauma, and how our teachers can support our students with trauma while protecting themselves from secondary trauma. Okay. So are you ready for the first question?
I think so.
Okay, so here we go.
Okay.
We are hearing our teachers more and more share mental health concerns they're experiencing every day. Are you seeing this as a larger trend, and what is responsible for this rise, if you will?
Okay. So I should say that I don't necessarily frame it as like mental health trends.
Okay.
I really frame it around wellness and well-being. So by that, I just mean like I take a holistic approach. So it doesn't mean that a person necessarily has to be in crisis to practice self-care. And I also define self-care a little bit differently. When I hear the word self-care, I think about an individual, but self-care, like restorative practices, is an interdependent process because we're not separate beings. We're all connected to one another, and it's in community that we can find our healing. So I want to say that first. In terms of trends and what I'm seeing, yes, I do see a rise in teacher stress. I absolutely see a rise in teacher burnout. And more importantly, I see a huge need that our children have. And that need being, they need educators who are filled up so that they can be empathetic, loving, caring, kind, and also expert teachers, if that makes sense. So that's one of the reasons why I started Sage Wellness. It is for teachers and it's also for students as well. So I think when we talked on the phone, I talked a little bit about this concept in Chinese medicine where they say you have to treat the mother to treat the child, right? And they're really talking about like organs, et cetera, but you could extend that metaphor beyond, right? So Sage Wellness wants to treat the mother, if you will, the teacher, in order to treat the child. So back to, how this came about. So, I started out as an educator, and then I was able to move into the world of like coaching. So I did some work as an instructional coach, as a literacy coach, and I also did work in social emotional competence and of course restorative practices. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because I've really been blessed and fortunate to work with organizations who really stood for things I believed in. So in literacy, absolutely, independent reading, students should be able to pick their own books, read based on their interest, read books that are also culturally relevant. And then, with restorative practices and social emotional competence, like it's a no-brainer. We absolutely have to relate to one another. We absolutely need empathy and social and self-awareness, et cetera, et cetera. So I say all that to say that as much as I love the work that I do and was doing, what I notice is that no matter how good the quote unquote product was, if schools and teachers and even admins were like at their wits' end, it didn't matter.
Right.
It didn't matter. And so for that reason, you know, it was kind of like, well, I need to do something. Something else has to happen here,
Right.
to support our teachers, because they're the ones they're the second parents.
So let me ask you this question. You're talking about treating the parent to treat the child. So I'm focused on like urban teachers, which is a teacher training program, and others, and then just districts and principals in general. What can we do to effectively address this growing issue? Because it starts with us, the people who are training the educators to go into the classroom, to have that mindset and preparedness. So what should we be doing to treat the child by treating ourselves first?
Sure. So I think the first thing that should happen is listening. And so that means, whether that means that, let's say in your organization, there's some sort of focus group and you're talking with teachers, and maybe you're also talking with alumni about what their experiences were, and how wellness could be incorporated into what you do. I really think it's important, and this really comes from my work in restorative practices, that we don't impose things on folks, that we hear from them first. So even in, for example, even in my work with Sage, yes, we offer yoga, yes, we offer Reiki, massage, et cetera, but I'm not gonna go into a school and just say, okay, here's our menu, right? First, I'm gonna talk with the teachers and find out what they're comfortable with, what's happening within the school culture, not only the teachers, but also the admin, and then we're gonna develop a plan. And so the second thing, in addition to listening, I think prioritizing literally like a wellness plan.
Okay.
So like in restorative practices work, we come up with what I'd like to call like a peace plan for the school. If you don't have a plan, then how is anything going to get done? So I think that, you know, listening, coming up with a plan, which means that you'll actually have to, again, talk with folks to find out what is pressing on them in the culture. And so, you know, sometimes what's pressing on teachers can be something as simple as time.
Right.
Well, not simple. What am I saying? Time is what? Time is always an issue. Always. We don't even have to survey that. Like, it just is. So there's time, and then also this issue of autonomy. And so one of the things that I do when I work with schools is help them come up with a wellness plan, but also beyond offering, like I said, yoga, et cetera, looking at places in the school schedule where, for example, you could have maybe like a dress down Friday, or, you know, an hour, excuse me, not an hour, like a half an hour longer recess, just places where teachers can be given back their time. But it goes back to the community too, because it might mean that sometimes, you know, for example, if there is a half an hour longer recess, that maybe another teacher steps in, but then the next day, do you get what I'm saying? Like, it really does take a village, and it does take a community to put these things together. But I think the most important aspect is listening and a plan.
And being intentional about
Absolutely.
what you're doing, that plan, and enacting that plan.
Absolutely. And I love that you said intentional, because you would never, I would never want it to be just another thing to check off, because that defeats the purpose. Even when I speak about self-care, there's something humanizing in it as well. And I think that in some respects, education and what we require of our educators and even our admin, in some ways has become dehumanizing. Something about that word intentionality really spoke to me. And I think, you know, to simplify that very strong word, dehumanization happens when we don't see and hear each other in the smallest and on the largest scale. And I think a lot of that is happening in our schools.
Systems.
You know, I think that we're encouraging folks to just press on when really what they need is like to sit down and be heard, or just sit down and breathe. Can I just get a minute?
Right.
Can I get a minute? Because it's no easy walk to be a teacher, and it's no easy walk to be a principal or assistant principal. And when we don't acknowledge that, I think we do run the risk of dehumanizing folks, of contributing to burnout, and creating a culture that is, I'm not going to use the word toxic, but is more challenging to navigate.
And so where can they find that minute? Because it's like, just take a minute and sit down and breathe. And speaking to like asking them like what their concerns are and asking our participants. I did that actually on Wednesday, and I actually have their notes about the questions they have regarding mental health or wellness or like how they can be healthy.
That's good.
And so what they're wondering is just that. Where can they find the time? And so this is the question that I want to ask. And I want to read it from here because it comes directly from them. So I don't want to not give the right words. So a lot of our teachers are feeling the October blues, the disillusionment phase, right? And are asking how to balance self-care and the realities of the day-to-day. What techniques can you share for teachers specifically that can help them stay well during this time?
That's a really big question. Let me maybe say three. So one of the things that is very helpful is mindfulness practice. If I could just go back and tell just a short story. So I started meditating and practicing mindfulness about 10 years ago now. And I came to the mat, that's what we call it. I came to the mat at a time in my life where it was just complete cataclysm. I won't say anything you can think of, but let me just say, I had bought a house, but I had been let go from a job, so I had this mortgage. My brother had transitioned, among other things. And so I learned this practice where you just literally sit still with your eyes open or your eyes closed, and all you're doing is watching the contents of your mind. And you might even just label the content of your mind or your thought as thinking, and you let that thought fall away. It's very hard for me to even describe how much it helped and how much it helped shift me and move me through that crisis. Now, I know that, I don't know if that, if that sounds good, but I know that teachers have planning periods. Honestly, sometimes when I pull up for work, I will sit in the car for 5 minutes and just allow myself to come down. I'll go into a mindfulness meditation. So literally 5 minutes. I was sharing with you on the way here, I was saying, oh my God, I'm like super nervous, like literally. And so I was practicing, so another tool is affirmations, right? So just feeding yourself positive self-talk, but that sugar wasn't working, right? I was like, no, my whole nervous system is jacked up. And so one other technique, did I really say technique? One other practice that I teach and that we can use is using the breath.
Okay.
The breath is the modulator of the entire nervous system, and the breath is rhythmic, just like we are. We are rhythmic beings. And so what I began to do was breathe in 4 through my nose, hold it 4, and breathe out 8.
Okay.
And I probably did it, I don't know, 5 times, and I could feel myself come down, if you will, and begin to calm down. This was really significant, I'm just gonna be honest, even for me, because often what I will go to is affirming. And then something clicked in me like, wait, this is not working because it's in my physiology. So I need a technique that's gonna shift my physiology, not simply my mind.
Right.
And once I began, it just began to bring me, peace. It's why I can sit here right now and like I could get up and do something, like we could all dance or something. Like it's okay. But it's such a beautiful gift that we all have access to, that literally in less than 3 minutes. Because you're right, it is always that time. And God damn it, I got to grade papers and I have to get ready for these kids. They're ready for me. The other beautiful thing I'll say is that when you develop a practice, so let's say if you develop a mindfulness practice, or you develop a breathing practice or an affirmation practice, what we know we can then share.
Right.
So when you're having, it's after lunch and your babies are coming in and you're really not in the mood, hold on for a second. Let's shift the lights. Let's cut the lights off. Maybe you're in a circle. Maybe you're at your desk. you can guide them as well with you. There is, am I talking too much?
No, you're doing great.
All right.
Yes.
So there is a
Yes,
principle, I'm just going to say in the universe, it's called resonance. And so what that means is that, how do I describe it? Let me back up. Let me say that educators have resonance. When I stand in front of a classroom, and if I'm resonating to a degree where I am peaceful, you will notice a shifting in your class. I hope that doesn't sound like magic to you, but I promise you. And if you're standing before your class and you're resonating frustration, you're going to get it back. And that's not to say that we shouldn't experience those things. And that's why I think restorative practices is really important too, because in restorative practices, we are, quote unquote, giving ourselves permission to also express that with our students and not pretend to be superhuman. So I think the two really, really go hand in hand. May I share a really short story?
Sure, please.
So I was working with a group of women. It was probably 7 women, and they all had their children with them. And the children were anywhere between ages 2 and 5. We had someone who was there to to watch the children. I was conducting a circle, and beforehand, the kids were all over the place. I was like, I don't know how we're going to meditate in this. I don't know what's going to happen. We're going to see. Literally, they were in 2 rooms down, but we could hear them where we were. And the intention of the circle was actually to bring self-care, right? When we started a simple mindfulness meditation, we created resonance. The children were quiet. I don't even know what they were doing, but it just became like this peaceful event, and we were able to serve the women in the way that they really needed to be served. So
resonance.
Yeah.
So let's then shift. Let's go to restorative practices, because
Okay.
you mentioned it. It's like the new buzzword, like rigor was a couple of years before, where
my favorite word.
rigor.
Yes.
Yes. So we're
Not
wondering,
really.
how do we make sure that we're doing restorative practices authentically? Like, what techniques can teachers use to check that they're doing this the right way? Because I'm not sure if you've heard, but the district, I believe, is moving towards having restorative practices in all of our Baltimore City public schools. So how can we, as a training program or working with teachers, how can we ensure that our teachers are doing that authentically so that resonance can really take place versus checking off another item on the checklist?
Okay. So I want to make sure I'm hearing your question correctly. Are you asking how urban teachers can support teachers in implementing restorative practices with fidelity, or generally?
Right, generally. So how can we all be sure that we're implementing restorative practices in the way that it should be, authentically done, versus just a rote piece that I do in the morning with a circle and close with a circle without that intentionality and that transference to the students happening?
Sure. So I think the first thing that I always teach is that restorative practices takes about 3 to 5 years to implement. So that should initially provide a framework and some perspective about what it is that we're actually doing. The other thing is to run from people who describe it as a technique, because it has to go deeper than that in order to be effective. What I want to say too is that, and I'm going to slap myself for saying it, but I'm going to say it anyway. The origins of restorative practices is rooted in indigenous cultures. So people say that all the time, and it's kind of like a blanket statement. And I'll be 100% honest with you, I'm still learning about the different cultures that it is rooted in. So for example, in some of the research that myself and a colleague were doing, we talked about restorative practices being rooted in the principle of Ubuntu. I hope I do not forget what it means. It means I am because you are, right? So anyone who is teaching or implementing restorative practices, it has to come from a deeper place in order to go to a deeper place. If you start at the surface technique level, you're going to be burnt out and pissed off, and you're going to be like, oh, this is a fly-by-night thing. Restorative practices is really about personal transformation. I was just watching a video put together by Teachers Democracy Project, and there was someone speaking about the fact that not only is it rooted in personal transformation, but it's also about adults and not necessarily about doing to children. So it really is about self-cultivation. And self-cultivation, I'll put it into a couple of different areas. One, and we're learning this now, is that to do restorative practices,
Right.
one needs to always be cultivating a race and equity lens. Because you're coming together in community, you're coming together in circle, and in order for us to understand each other, I think it's important that we also understand something about our histories as well, and something about the lens with which we see one another. So, excuse me, that becomes really important in restorative practices. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So I was in a circle with several practitioners. It was, what was it? It was like some sort of focus group. And so the facilitator asked us to think about successes that we've had in restorative practices. And so one gentleman shared a story that in his description of the restorative conversation, he referred to a young 16-year-old African-American boy as an assailant. So that's problematic on many different levels. So this is what I mean about making sure that a race and equity lens is cultivated, because he sat, and he was an older white man, he sat in a circle with a young African-American boy, with a young white boy, and I think it was another African-American student. And the way in which he proceeded to talk about the black boy, because that's how we referred to him, and the assailant was very problematic. And I thought about, what did that mean for the black mother and for the white mother who was present for this particular circle? And yeah, so I was gonna say it's those small things, but they're not small because they're huge. Because restorative practices also is not just about words and techniques, it's also a feeling. You can feel that when you come into a circle and you're sitting before, I'm just gonna say, ignorance. I'm not gonna apply any maliciousness to it. It's just ignorance. So it's important for us to cultivate that race and equity lens. It's important for us to cultivate our own social emotional competence, especially self-awareness and social awareness. And the piece in social emotional competence that is so moving to me is the empathy piece. I always teach that empathy, that emotion is actually the universal language, not our thoughts. And so the reason why that's important to the restorative practice is because, for example, I might not understand right now if you got up and just decided to, I don't know, throw your shoe at me. I'd be like, what is this girl's problem? You know, what's her problem? But if I were to use my emotions, I could clearly understand that something's got to be upsetting you. So at least it brings me, even if it's just an inch closer to you, to understanding, then I'm able to foster connection. And that's the other foundational piece of restorative practices that I feel is important, and that is that relational component. It's not about rules and techniques, it's about relationships, and I think that's what makes it so hard. And I think, should I say hard? I think that's what can make it so personally challenging, so challenging in terms of school culture and climate, because it really is a deep work.
So you said something to me the other day when we were on the phone that was really powerful for me. You tied restorative practices into the wellness of the teacher in the classroom. You've done a little bit here, but can you just talk a little bit more about how implementing restorative practices and approaches in the classroom was actually going to help the teacher feel more well in the space, because a lot of our teachers may be implementing restorative practices in schools where they're the only one in a classroom implementing restorative practices. The entire school hasn't decided to implement that, and so a lot of that is happening right now. So what are the benefits? Like, can you tie that connection together between implementing restorative practices in your classroom and how that's going to actually help the wellness of the educator leading that space?
Sure. So, and now I'm shivering. I knew this was going to happen. I'm sorry. I get
Here.
cold very easily. If I could I start big? I'm going to start big and standard. Okay. So at the school level, what we always say is that restorative practices can buy back teaching time. These are the standards, right? So they can buy back teaching time. And it's true. You know, it absolutely reduces suspensions. It absolutely reduces office referrals. So that's like at the big level. Okay. It's at the macro school level and at the micro. So with teachers in the classroom, and let me back up and say, so I started out as a Baltimore City public school educator. Okay. And so one thing that was always important to me, and I think restorative practices is the same way, when we talk about classroom management, the way that I managed my classroom was through relationships. I didn't use stickers and charts and incentives. It was really about knowing the students and them knowing me. And not that I had a perfect class, but I also didn't deal with things that I saw in other classrooms. And so I mention that because that's what restorative practices can do for an individual teacher. If an individual teacher is willing to put themselves on a line, share their story, and open up to students, the students will then open up as well. So I want to share a quick story, and I think I shared this with you as well. So I was working in a K-8 school, and I was going to help a teacher with a circle. She's a 7th grade teacher. We were standing outside her door waiting for the class to come in, and she shared with me that she had just gotten like some really bad news. If I'm remembering the story correctly, she shared that either 2 of her friends were really physically harmed. I don't think that this is terrible, I don't think that they were murdered, but they were physically harmed, like really in a hard way. And so she was visibly upset. She knew her class had to, she knew her class was coming. Yeah. I got called away, wonderful, good for me. Long story short, she went in and started the circle. As the story goes, she told me that she started the circle and the students noticed that like she was bothered. So they asked her, hey, what's up? And she told them. That was a risk. She didn't have to take it, but she did. But because of that risk, other students started sharing things that they had also been through. And she had 2 students who, in her circle, who she always clashed with, like totally. Mm-hmm. And what she shared was that one of those students had shared that he had seen his father murdered when he was 3. And she said it clicked for her in that moment, like for whatever reason, like it helped her understand him. Mm-hmm. And we don't always have to go that deep off the deep end, but she said that, from that moment on, like they were good. Sometimes all we need to do is to have the ability to be heard and seen, because that young boy was carrying that, and clearly maybe he just needed to show that, and she needed to hear it, so that she could stop saying that it was a behavioral issue. You just don't know my story. You don't know it, maybe because I haven't shown it to you, but maybe also because you didn't ask. And so I think that is the potential power of circle and restorative practices. It is an opportunity for us to see and hear one another. Story is a powerful gift. And at the same time, as a facilitator, even though story can be a powerful gift, it also can be misused. And that's what I mean about about implementing with fidelity and taking your time. I don't believe that if a whole school isn't ready, I don't think that you should force people to do it, because I think that you'll end up causing more harm than good. I think it's important to go with those who are interested first,
Okay.
who are capable, who are competent. Not that others are incompetent, but just that they're ready and they're able to begin to have these conversations with students, and then allow them to support others in that over time. Yeah, I think that's really, really important. It's not a blanket. We're dealing with people and we're dealing with children, our most vulnerable population. And I say that just because of the way in which sometimes we do kids, you know.
So this brings me to, I think, my last question, and this comes from the story that you just shared. And I wrote down what are some strategies, but I'm going to take the word strategies out because I feel like that's the wrong word. I'm not quite sure what the right word is, Malene, but like it's clearly not about the strategy. It's about the relationship with the students. So let me rephrase. I'll try.
Okay.
But what are some ways, I suppose, teachers can support these students who are struggling with trauma that they're bringing into the classroom every day? And then what are ways that we protect ourselves as educators from the secondary trauma that we're experiencing with our students? Mm-hmm. Like, how do we do that?
Mm-hmm. Ask that one more time.
So it was a two-part question.
Yeah.
Sure. So the first piece is, like, how do we support our students that are struggling and dealing with trauma, which you said was on the rise? Mm-hmm. And then how do we as educators who are stepping into classrooms where there's trauma, like the educator you just described here, mm-hmm. how do we protect ourselves, if protect is the right word, mm-hmm. When students are sharing or experiencing trauma or bringing in that into the classroom space?
Mm-hmm. So I don't want to give a rote response, but I do think it's important to know what the signs of trauma are. I think, so let me back up. What I think is happening is that too often students who have been traumatized or who are experiencing trauma have been labeled and stigmatized. And so the question really is, how do you release that? And so part of the answer is education. So do folks know what trauma looks like, what it sounds like, what it talks like, what it walks like? So educating oneself, and then you can also push your admin, like, we need this. Like, clearly there's something going on here. We need this. So advocating for that. So educating oneself first. I think that one of the things that I do when I work with schools is, and forgive me if this sounds trite, I really do believe in planning. So if we know that this exists, what can we create in the school that is not punitive, right? I was doing recently a training at DJS, and anybody want to guess what percentage of young people who've been incarcerated, what percentage do you think have experienced trauma?
95.
Somebody said 95, somebody said 100, what else? Yeah, you guys are basically like 90%. So the reason why I'm bringing it up is because what we've done and what we are doing is that we're punishing trauma. So one, I think that, we have to see that, and then we have to see it in order to shift it. So see it, educate oneself, and then begin planning. So what do I mean by planning? So instead of suspending them, is there a way that we can create something like a peace room where kids can come to calm down? Is there a way that if we know somebody has a hard time, like I remember there was this student, she absolutely was sexually abused. She could not sit still in a class for a very long time. In certain classes she could sit longer. Why? Because she felt more safe. I mean, what's so hard about that? Like, let's not punish her for that. But is there a way that, if a student needs to get up and walk just to feel safe, to go talk with someone, is there a way that we can plan that as a community and make it okay? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So I don't have a whole long list, but that's like where my brain goes first. In terms of teachers and vicarious trauma,
Right.
this is going to sound ridiculous, but I think the first thing is to know where your line is and to assess your line. And by that, I just mean that I don't mean in hearing, student stories. I just mean we have to be aware of ourselves. Where are we feeling pushed? And when we're feeling pushed, how can we set some sort of boundary for ourselves? What I believe about teachers is that our hearts are huge. And I think a lot of us, forgive me, I think a lot of us go in because we want to help and we want to kind of like save the world, right? But you can't, there's a quote that says you can't serve from an empty vessel, right? So all of that is intertwined. And that's too where the mindfulness practice comes in too, because it really helps you tune in to where you actually are. So yeah. So I feel like I'm going all over the place.
No,
but
spot on.
yeah. So some mindfulness, self-awareness, being able to set your limits and boundaries, and asking for support.
You have to be in tune with yourself. Again, I keep coming back to the word intentionality. Like even before going into school, the mindfulness techniques that you gave us, figuring out where you are as a person as you're stepping into these spaces, and then once you feel those ways, being able to provide some kind of coping for yourself to navigate and continue. And that could be by yourself or with others, like you said, ask for help. So those are the questions that we've kind of curated for you. So now we're going to open it up to the audience here as well as anyone on Facebook Live. So if you're on Facebook Live, type in your questions and then we'll ask Malene directly the questions that you have. So I'll start with the audience first. Is there anyone that has a question for Malene? Yes.
So Japara mentioned.
Are we waiting? Great. We're going to use the microphone. Thank you so much.
So Japara mentioned that Baltimore City Public Schools is making a shift to have restorative practices in all schools and in all classrooms. But I think I heard you say that may not be the best way to implement restorative practice. So what would it look like for a teacher or an administrator to assess what classrooms, what teachers are ready to lead restorative practice? Who makes that evaluation? How do you make that determination?
That's a really, really good question. So let me think about that. So from an administrator's standpoint, I think that, so I have something called a readiness assessment, right? I'm trying to remember what's on it. One of the first things that you want to look at is capacity in the school, right? So I mean capacity in a couple of ways. I mean capacity in terms of time. I mean capacity in terms of bodies. I also mean capacity in terms of mindset. So, for example, is my school culture largely punitive? Do I have some folks who are more aligned with a restorative mindset? If the answer is yes, then you could begin in a couple different ways, right? So the first might be you might work with particular teachers and invite others to participate in a study group first. So you're educating yourself about what restorative practices is. You're educating the team about what the expectations are. The other thing could be that you might take that small cohort and they might begin some training, right? And so I always like to start with circle training. So they might begin implementing in a small way, if that makes sense. And then over time, it might lead into some whole school training. But I think it's really important to take stock of who's in the school, what the mindset is, and even as we do with instruction, scaffold, right? So maybe even level out, where the staff is. Let's say 40%, I feel like, okay, restorative. 20% never in life, right? And the rest maybe somewhere in between. That's really loose, but that's my immediate, response to that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for your question. I think we have some questions on Facebook Live. So Tiffany's going to read those for us.
So we first have a question from Malene, who said she's at work still writing IEPs while she's listening.
Oh,
Okay,
gosh.
Elena.
Her question is, how can we shift from just a selected group to a whole school implementation of restorative practices, similar to the question before? She said, our admin keeps telling us that it's got to be a grassroots effort, but I believe we need a stronger whole school leadership. How can this crew, led by her, take it upon herself or themselves to impart it into a wider reach? So they're kind of going bottom up because the top
Wow.
is putting the burden on them.
Right. First of all, that's really awesome. Because I believe teachers have a lot of power. Depending on what the dynamic is with administrators will determine the outcome. Here's what I would say. When people see things working, when people see things working, they're more inclined to ask you about what's going on. So I say that to say, like, even when I first started supporting schools and implementing restorative practices, I knew my number one job was to go in and make sure I demonstrated the power of it. And so I think there honestly is a lot of power in being able to implement and folks seeing it work, especially for admin. Are you kidding? So you might even, I'm sorry. So you might even, start like a small tracking system on your own. I'm not sure how you're implementing, but let's say if you're doing community building circles, I would definitely keep track of how many circles you're doing and if there's any shift in like in the classroom culture. So for example, if you have 4 students, and forgive me for using this word, I really have to find another word, but if you have 4 students in your classroom who are typically high flyers, but you notice that their high flyerness is shifting, that might be something that you would keep track of. If by chance you're implementing like restorative dialogues where you're bringing students together who are coming together to resolve conflict, absolutely kind of keep track of that so then you can show the effects of it. Honestly, that would be my first go-to, because one of the things that is important is leadership when it comes to restorative practices. And that is not to, let me not even say that. Like having a principal on board can really help. However, it's also, I think it's also great that you're starting from grassroots because I think it'll be more authentic and ultimately you probably will have more buy-in. But that would be my suggestion.
I see some educators out in the audience who I know have done a lot of, speaking of grassroots efforts around supporting teachers and wellness, or some teachers here that came specifically because right now they're experiencing that October blues focused on like the disillusionment and are tired. So are there any questions for how educators can support each other in the wellness space, or are there any questions about, and I'm kind of leading here because I know I'm asking questions, but around wellness right now and what that looks like teacher to teacher?
So I'm going to give her the mic, but repeat the question.
The question was, okay, sure.
Hi, I'm Deanna Thomas. I'm a kindergarten teacher in West Baltimore and the founder of Happy Teacher Revolution, or movement to support the mental health and wellness of teachers and teacher-led support groups. We're sort of like AA, but for teachers, except we'll have a drink afterwards. And my question about the human connection piece is that as a teacher who's with 29 kindergarten students all day long, it still can be a very isolating profession. What I'm wondering are what are some action steps or strategies for teachers to connect with one another in an authentic and vulnerable way so that we can develop our own social emotional competencies so we can foster that in the classroom.
And her question, which is not going to be worded as eloquently, was how can teachers build connections with other teachers, because teaching oftentimes in your classroom in your own space can be very isolating. How can they have these spaces where they're authentically connecting to improve their own social emotional competence and wellness.
So I'm going to take the RP approach on this one, restorative practices approach. So I think the most important thing is, first of all, are they asking that question? In other words, is that something that they want for themselves? And if it is, then move to some actionable items. So the first might be, working with other teachers and finding out where they are and what they might want to do. Here's the thing, time is always upon us, right? So I know at a lot of schools, or not at a lot, at some schools, teachers go out afterwards and do happy hour, or teachers might go out together and do yoga classes, things like that. It could be that the teacher also talks with admin and talks about ways that they can incorporate some sort of wellness activity during planning periods in the faculty lounge. These are just my ideas, but I think, and this is why I say the RP approach is important, I think start by asking them and see if that's even the question. Because honestly, sometimes teachers just want to go the hell home. Do you know what I mean? They don't want an extra assignment to go and talk with admin and things like that. I think that's one of the reasons why at Sage Wellness, we actually come on site to offer the recharge retreats, because we don't want to ask them to take more time out of their day. Like, come on, for your planning period and or after school, come get some Reiki. We'll love up on you. Come let us massage you, et cetera, et cetera. So I really think the answer to that question would have to come from within, because each of us have different needs. And I'll just leave it at that.
So we have a couple more questions on the Facebook Live, so we're going to go back to Facebook Live. Tiffany, if you can let us know what the next question is.
So the next question comes from Mary, and she asks, what about the lack of respect from students and administrators? That can be where the major stress comes from. So how do you deal with that?
So let me repeat the question. Mary's asking, what about the lack of respect from students and or administration, which could be the impetus for a lot of the stress that teachers are feeling?
Yeah, it's true. Well, I want to start with students first, because I find that the young people are easier than the adults. I think that's one place where restorative practices can really help. I wish I could ask you a question back, but what I find is that if we are able to just kind of slow down, and I'm just going to say, let some of the dirt fall off of our shoulder when it comes to respect and students' responses or even student behavior. And if we're able to use things like restorative questions, in other words, sometimes we say, like, let's get curious and non-judgmental about what's going on. Let's not even label it disrespect yet. Let's just ask, hey, what's going on? You just called me out my name. You just cursed me out. What's going on? And then we're going to listen. And then we're going to ask another question, right? But it's not going to be punitive in nature. It's going to be more curious in nature, if that makes sense. So restorative questions always ask what happened or what's going on, or how you feeling about it. If that's appropriate, you might already be able to tell how they're feeling about it. And they'll let you know how I'm feeling. You might ask, well, how's that affecting you? Anybody else affected? All right, so what needs to happen to make this right? And maybe you won't even go through the whole series, but the fact that a student is being asked a question, it's like disarming, because they're so used to being talked at and talked to. So really, that's my spiel about disrespect. Not that some things can't be over the top, but what I've noticed is that the more we're able to kind of let it go and respond with some sort of empathy and compassion and get curious, the less you'll have those kinds of quote unquote disrespectful behaviors. And respect is a really tricky thing too, especially when you're talking about culture, because respect in one culture might look different in another, and that's why that whole race and equity lens is also important. So I'll leave that there. Admin, I feel like that can be really tricky, just because there's always a power dynamic at play. And frankly, there's always a power dynamic between adults and children. And I think that's also part of the work with restorative practices, kind of releasing that power dynamic that exists between adults and children. Admin is tricky because they are your quote unquote boss. So I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I'm just going to be honest. Like, I don't know that I have a good answer for that, other than try to communicate what your concerns are and come from an authentic place, not a blaming place, even if it's absolutely absurd. I mean, I'm so serious. Just try to come from a place of authenticity and truth about how whatever is happening is affecting you. Speak about your purpose, like why you're even in the school, what you wish to do, and ask the admin to help you do that and let them know what it is that you need. And if they're not feeling that, I can't say it on Facebook Live, but if they're not feeling that, it's just kind of like, all you can do sometimes is show up and then show up again. And we also can close our doors and just be with our kids too. That helps. But I feel you, you know, I understand. I've been in some toxic places, so.
Let's go back then to an audience question. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Just speak loudly. Okay. I think with teachers, it's hard to prioritize taking the time to, you know, even just breathe. And so I'm wondering if you have any words to help teachers to reframe in their own mind sort of how they think about wellness and how, you know, potentially reframing it can help them to actually prioritize it in their own life.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. So
Let me go ahead and repeat. Sorry, they just told me that you were very loud, but I'm going to make it a little bit louder since I have the mic. You did well. You did really well. What Allie was saying was, how can we help our teachers shift their mindset to prioritize, even taking a minute to breathe when there's maybe so much else to do, and how do we reframe it for themselves?
So, for whatever reason, my mind is going to, what is it, crucial conversations? You all familiar with that? So there's 3 questions, and I don't think I remember the third, but I remember the first 2 that they say you should ask, right? First, what is it I want? All right, what do I want for myself in this situation? So I feel like it's important for us to ask that question, and also connect it to, why am I even here? And by that I just mean, what is my purpose in this classroom? And I think that with the answer to that question, then the next question would be, well, what do I need to do to ensure that I can do this? And you can't serve from an empty vessel. And so wellness is not over here. I'm here, and like they're not separate. They have to go together. The second question from Crucial Conversation is, what do I want for others? So, in other words, what do I want for my students? How can I do that, right? If I am stressed to the limit, I'm not going to be able to do it, no matter how much I'm pushing myself. I'm not going to be able to do it. So maybe just some reframing there. The last question, I do remember it, is, what do I want for this relationship? And maybe you would ask, in my current state, can I give that? And in my current state, can I give that to myself? And if I can't, then I probably need to go and take care of myself.
question right here. Yes.
So another Facebook Live question.
Oh.
This one comes from Anna.
Okay.
And Anna asks, what kind of district support is necessary? In the models I've read about, there is a separately staffed cool-down room. I worry sometimes that districts implement restorative practices to save on costs and to appeal to people, but expect everything to happen in the classroom and for teachers to train themselves on their own time. At the same time, they're cutting down suspensions drastically and
Yeah.
leaving a less safe school environment in the end. What does robust, effective district policy look like?
Okay. So there was a lot of context around that question, but the question was asking what is the role of districts and administrations in providing the framework for restorative practices in the district, because they're using restorative practices in the cool down rooms and cutting down suspensions, but while they're doing that, they're not providing for the safety of the teachers in the building because it's not being implemented wholeheartedly. So what is the role of administration in laying the framework for restorative practices in schools?
Yeah, I think even to go further and go back to the district. So I cannot believe I'm shivering like this. I am embarrassed. I know in Oakland, Oakland's district actually did create a restorative practices wing, if you will. And that wing was charged with training schools. That wing also had folks who could actually go out to schools and support with the implementation. To be 100% honest, I think that's the most fair way to implement at the district level and at the administrative level. I think it's unfair to say that, okay, since I've read this article, I understand how to do restorative practices. You absolutely do not. And I think that's what you're speaking to. And I do think that it's actually dangerous if we're only getting into restorative practices to reduce suspension numbers, because what sometimes happens is there could be really egregious acts that happen at school, and students are kind of allowed to stay. And there's this equating restorative practices with zero consequences, and that's not the point. You know, in terms of the responsive and the restorative practices, it really is about accountability. And we define that in two ways. One, a person has to acknowledge that they've caused some sort of harm. And then two, they have to do something about it. I'm about to get my coat. This is really embarrassing. They have to do something about it. And that's why, I talk a lot about the balance between restorative practices and the traditional, which is punitive. That's why we say it takes 3 to 5 years, because sometimes our babies aren't necessarily ready, and that's okay. We just know we're on a journey to get to a place where our school becomes so safe that they feel safe enough to come and work it out through conversation rather than putting their hands on each other. I feel like there was something else, but I mean, to your point, you know, I agree. You know, I've seen literacy programs rolled out in a similar way. For example, we're going to do independent reading. Okay, but where are the books? You know, like, oh, don't do that to us. That's really unfair. So I hear you.
So we have time for one last question, which comes from the audience. What's your question?
For teachers that are doing the grassroots and are just getting started,
Mm-hmm.
and they are meeting with some challenges, what advice do you have for them to continue on in their pursuit of this culture shift in their classroom? So like advice and motivation.
Let me revoice
Okay.
for the camera for people on Facebook Live. So what motivational, encouraging words can you give teachers who are just beginning this restorative practice work to continue if they're facing some of those challenges when it's coming like from the teachers in a grassroots way versus being a forced implementation? What advice and how can they stay encouraged?
Challenges with the students.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to know.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Challenges
you
with
mean students are resistant to coming together, like to have conversations and things like that?
Yeah.
And probably circle, right? Like, I don't want to sit in this circle. Get out of here.
High school, so they're
Okay, all right. So that's a good one. Can I tell a really quick story? So at one of the schools I used to work with, I think I was maybe there for 2 months. So there was a student who, she would always get into trouble. And when she saw me coming, she would run from me, literally. And she'd be like, I'm not talking to that lady. I don't want to talk to that lady. So that's fine. You don't have to talk to that lady. But over time, by small things like, hey, good morning, how's everything going? Oh, what you up to? Da, 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 da. Over time, we were able to have restorative conversations. And what I'll say is maybe like 5 months in, it was the best feeling in the world. She came to my door and she was bringing another student. And she was like, just go talk to Ms. Bell because she'll help you work it out, right? So my point in that is to say that students might be resistant at first because it's new. And so the most important thing to do is to continue to build trust. And I'm going to say inside and outside of the circle, right? So that means in the morning, and I'm not saying that you're doing this at all, but in the morning, greeting students. Don't worry about whether hats are on, shirts are tucked in. Hey, how's everything going? Just begin with the relational aspect, because what will happen is when you come to the circle, it's going to spill over. Does that make a little sense? So continue to always nurture relationships inside and outside of the circle. What else would I say? Continue to study, talk with other people who are implementing, learn about some of the challenges that they've had as well. I think the main thing is just to continue to move forward, but move forward with the intention of building trust. Whether it's happening in a circle or in a conflict resolution environment, just continue to build trust and also let the students know what it is. You know, maybe even show them some videos about it. Also, there's this really good video called Under the Surface. I've had some high school teachers use it. It's all about empathy, but it's not informational. Like, it's something relational. So even if it starts with smaller conversations, just something that can engage the students. Another approach might be, like I've seen some schools use like academic circles. Because some students, I'm not sitting in a circle, no. I'm not coming in a circle and doing this campy whatever, right? But if I come and I'm coming in a circle to talk about Othello, then they're kind of getting used to that practice of kind of being next to one another, of having discourse in a way that is maybe a little more non-threatening because it's intellectual rather than emotional, if that makes sense. Then just gradually introducing, I don't want to say bigger concepts, but do you get what I mean? Yeah.
So we're almost out of time, but I think there's one more burning question from the audience. So I've been told by the powers that be that we can ask the last question.
So I was just hearing a lot about wellness and was just kind of wondering, I know a lot of teachers come into the classroom already with their own life and their own issues outside of work.
Yep.
And you know, a lot of people are teared away from therapy or counseling. So as far as that mental health aspect, what are some triggers or things that teachers may notice that may, I would say, allow them to understand that it's important that I seek more help and that may be counseling and therapy? So what
That's
type
a really
of
good,
triggers
yeah.
or things should a teacher notice to say, okay, I need extra help
Okay.
or more support?
Yeah, that's a really good.
So let me go ahead and
oh,
revoice
okay.
again for the Facebook Live audience. So he was asking, the gentleman in the audience was asking, what are some triggers teachers should notice? Because teachers come in, they're people too, with outside lives, and wellness we know is important regardless of the profession you're in. So what should they notice if something happens maybe within the school day that should tell them absolutely you need to continue seeking outside therapeutic support in order for them to be, as a person, to be well? Is that correct? Okay.
That's good. So I think one of the first things would be just fatigue. Like tired, I don't even want to say all the time, but just like I'm going to describe it as like an energy drain. Like when you wake up in the morning, you don't even want to go in. I mean, even in the smallest way, because what happens is that usually gets bigger, and then you might even find yourself just like dreading going in. The other thing is noticing like your own temperature check. So are you short? You know, are you shorter than usual? Not only in the classroom, but at home. I think you could also pay attention to kind of like your physiology. You know, when you're in the classroom, are you balled up and tight, or are you open? Does that make sense? And I think you should pay attention. You can pay attention to your thoughts. What kind of thoughts are you having? You know, and by that, I even mean in relation to the students that you teach, your coworkers, your admin. Can you not stand them? Are you sick of seeing them? If you see them one more day, you don't know what the hell you're gonna do. Like I'm just saying, like, really, it might be time for you to kind of step back. Wait a minute, hold on. I might need to do a little self-care, and I might even need to go talk with somebody, because it's just too much. It's too much on me. Even I would say withdrawal. So maybe you're standing in the classroom, but you're not really there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You're there, but you're not really home. You're off somewhere else. Okay. Those are just a couple things that kind of come to my mind. Yeah.
So I want to thank Malene, who through the shivers gave us some really powerful.
I'm not even gonna watch this. It's so embarrassing.
No,
Okay.
it was really good. Some really great answers. I know one thing that I'm going to challenge myself, and I'm going to challenge all the educators who I see it in schools every day, to try one of the 3 mindfulness techniques that you gave, and I'll reframe them. They were that quiet meditation, that affirmation and self-talk, and the breathing exercises 4 in and 8 seconds out. I mean, because what do you have to lose? It's only a couple of minutes, so actually challenge yourself to try those, and I'm going to challenge myself to be intentional about putting them in my life as well, and that's a nugget that I got from you. So thank you so much for sharing. Also want to thank Humanin for having us here in this space, wonderful space in East Baltimore, and then also want to shout out and plug our recruitment. If you're interested or know someone in your school who's interested in becoming a teacher, find us at urbanteachers.org, or you can email us at recruitment@urbanteachers.org. Again, thank you so much for being here, as well as thank you in the audience, and thank you on Facebook Live. That's it.